There's exactly one way to live for 60 years on the most haunted land in America. You bolt your doors from the inside and the outside. You lock your windows. You lock your cabinets. You chain vicious dogs at both ends of your house, one at each end anchored to iron stakes, so that nothing can approach from either direction without first meeting teeth. And you never ever talk about what's out there in the dark. Kenneth and Edith Myers figured that out. They came to this land in the early 1930s and stayed until death made them leave. 60 years of locked doors and chained dogs and a life so deliberately isolated, they maintained close contact with almost no one. They had no children, made no explanations, just two people and whatever arrangement they had made with the darkness on the other side of those walls. The family that came after them never got the memo. And what followed with them was 18 months of terror. But to understand what happened to that family and to the families before them, we have to go back, much further back than most people realize. This story doesn't start with the TV show that made Skinwalker Ranch famous, or the scientist or the government program that eventually designated this property in classified documents as a site of, and I'm quoting, anomalous events of interest. This story starts 8,000 years ago, 30 miles from where that bolted house stands, in Sago Canyon, Utah. Carved into the sandstone walls are more than 80 life-sized figures, some towering over 4 feet tall, painted in deep red ochre. They have no arms, no legs, hollow eyes, or no eyes at all. Some carry staffs and some hold snakes. They're not human, or they're not only human. Archaeologists call them shamanic visions. But ask yourself, why here? Why does the most concentrated, most unclassifiable ancient rock art in the American Southwest cluster in this basin? What were the people in this valley seeing that people everywhere else were not? Right here, within striking distance of the land we're discussing, a single petroglyph known to local researchers as the Uintah Basin Bigfoot. It's a warrior figure, massive feet, a severed head, and 6 fingers on each hand. That specific detail appears in anomalous carved figures on multiple continents, left by cultures with no contact with each other. Someone carved 6 fingers in this valley deliberately and intended for it to be found. The people who came after those ancient artists, the Ute Indians, they understood something about this very specific piece of land that they have never stopped believing. They call it the path of the Skinwalker. Tribal members are forbidden from setting foot on it. Not were forbidden, they are forbidden, present tense right now today. That prohibition has never been lifted, not even after the TV crews moved in. The curse on this specific region traces to the Civil War, when the Ute allied with Kit Carson's forces against the Navajo, helping to drive them from their lands on the brutal forced march known as the Long Walk. The Navajo, the legend says, did not forget. They unleashed the Skinwalkers on Ute territory as retaliation, a curse born from betrayal aimed at this land. 1776, Spanish missionary Silvestre Velez de Escalante is leading an expedition through this basin, a careful, methodical man keeping a meticulous journal. In that journal, he records strange fireballs moving over his campfire at night. That entry exists. It is in the historical record. The first European to write about this land wrote about something in the sky above it. By the early 1900s, settlers were homesteading the Uintah Basin. One family, the Locks, staked their claim on this particular piece of land. The same piece of land known as Skinwalker Ranch. They were building an ordinary life on ordinary ground. Then one day, a man appeared on their property. Clothing appropriate to the area, nothing unusual at first glance. But as he got closer, the family noticed something that didn't fit. Beneath his outer clothes, visible at the collar and the cuffs, a dazzling blue jumpsuit. Bright in a way that had no place in rural Utah in 1905. The kind of fabric that simply did not exist at that time. He asked for water, he sat with the family, he had a long, unhurried conversation. And before he left, he gave them something they didn't ask for. He told them exactly where on this property they must never dig. Then he walked away. No one could say which direction he went, he was simply gone. That story was considered so remarkable it was passed down through every family that subsequently owned this land, not as legend to be laughed at, as a warning to be taken seriously. By the 1930s, Kenneth and Edith Myers came to this land with practical intentions, to build a working cattle ranch. They assembled roughly 500 acres in the heart of the Uintah Basin. They were not naive, they were not dreamers, they were ranchers, grounded, hardworking, the kind of people who understood land and long Utah winters. Across 60 years on this property, they maintained close relationships with only a couple of people in the surrounding community. 2 people in 60 years, that's not shyness, that's a choice. Before they ever came to this land, they had a child, a baby who died in infancy. They never had another. A couple carrying the worst grief a parent can know, who then chose to come to the most isolated, most avoided land in the region and make it their entire world. No children growing up in the fields, no grandchildren at the table. Their legacy was the land. And when the land is your only legacy, silence becomes its guardian. There's one physical detail on this property that no one has ever satisfactorily explained: the original homestead. The first structure ever built here at the foot of what is now called Skinwalker Ridge. It was abandoned. At some point, the family simply walked away from those buildings and rebuilt on the eastern side of the property. They moved away from the ridge. Those original structures are still standing, sort of. A journalist given access described 3 decaying buildings on the verge of collapse. He walked through them with an electromagnetic meter, but he never published what the meter showed. Kenneth Myers had lived on this property for roughly 15 years when the winter of 1948 hit. Brutal cold, the ranch isolated, a snowstorm, and there was a knock at the door. Kenneth opened it to find a tall, rangy man in a long black coat. The man's face was in shadow. He introduced himself as being from the sheriff's department. Now, Kenneth Myers had lived in the region for 15 years, and he knew the county. He knew the faces of the people who worked it. He had never seen this man before in his life. What was said in that conversation was never repeated, at least not in full. Kenneth mentioned it had happened. The story surfaced quietly in the community, the way things do when someone needs to make sense of something. But what the stranger said at that door stayed with Kenneth. He never shared it, at least not publicly. Whatever it was, he took it inside, closed the door, and buried it for the rest of his life. Now hold both strangers together. 1905, a man in a dazzling blue suit arrives, delivers a warning about where never to dig, and disappears without a trace. 1948, a man whose face cannot be seen arrives in a snowstorm, claims authority he can't be verified to have, says something that is never repeated, and disappears. The one rule the investigators on the television show keep encountering, the one warning that surfaces from every local source, the one prohibition passed down through every family that ever owned this ground: you must never dig. Whatever those 2 men were, whatever they knew, that instruction is still being honored today. While Kenneth and Edith stayed silent on their 500 acres, the land surrounding them was anything but quiet. Joseph Jr. Hicks was a science teacher at a junior high in Roosevelt, Utah. He was a Mormon church official who traveled constantly across the region. People talked to him, ranch families, Native American families, neighbors who had never told anyone else what they'd seen. Hicks had his own first sighting in 1960, a large glowing object moving in ways no aircraft could. He started asking questions. He started keeping files. By the time he stopped, he had documented over 400 UFO sightings across the Uintah Basin. 400 accounts from hundreds of separate people. He wrote, UFO activity really started getting intense in the early 50s. Cases where the whole school, teachers included, saw things that were hovering over the town in broad daylight. At least half a dozen of his witnesses described seeing living beings in the windows and portholes of craft. Hicks estimated over 10% of the entire Uintah Basin population had witnessed something they could not explain, and he found a pattern. UFO appearances consistently coincided with cattle mutilations. When something was seen in the sky, something was dead in the field the next morning. 2 of his witnesses matter especially here, because their land shared a boundary with the Myers property. John Garcia, whose ranch bordered the eastern edge, watched an orange object the size of a house float silently above his fence line before it shot straight up and vanished. His wife saw it too. Charles Wynn, to the northwest, was outside one night when a blinding white light, he compared it to an arc welder, came directly at him. He dropped into a water-filled ditch, covered his head, and waited. He genuinely believed he was about to die. By the 1970s, the Utah Highway Patrol had received so many reports from across this region that they stopped filling out incident reports altogether because there was simply too much to document. And through all of it, Edith talked quietly. A local drugstore clerk told Junior Hicks that Edith Myers had UFO stories. Not a report, just stories, shared in private with a couple of people she trusted. Away from a skeptic brother-in-law in a world that wasn't ready to hear it. Kenneth Myers died in April of 1987. He was 86 years old. Edith stayed alone now on 500 acres with a single companion, one three-legged dog, until even that dog was gone. She eventually left for a rest home and she died in March of 1994. And the land sat empty. When the next family walked through that door, here's what they found. Deadbolts on every door, not just the front door, every door, mounted on both sides. Bars on some of the windows, locks on the kitchen cabinets. At both ends of the house, they found iron stakes driven into the ground. Heavy chains were still attached. Vicious dogs had been kept on those chains deliberately, one at each end, so that nothing could approach from either direction without first meeting teeth. A researcher who investigated the property was told this had been done after a number of incidents. He was given no further information about what those incidents were. No photograph of that house in its sealed-up state has ever been published. No record exists beyond the account of the family who found it and Kenneth's skeptic brother who denied the locks were ever there. Two different accounts, and a brother who swears nothing ever happened. A house built by someone who had decided across 60 years on this land that nothing could be left to chance. The man in a blue suit warned the first family were never to dig. The man in the black coat said something to Kenneth Myers in a snowstorm that he never repeated. And Kenneth and Edith Myers spent 60 years learning, through whatever means this land chose to teach them, exactly what it took to survive here. Kenneth and Edith Myers were the last people to understand the rules of this land from the inside. When Edith died in 1994, the property passed briefly to family and was sold within months. The new family walked in with no map, no warning, no knowledge of the man in the blue suit or the stranger at the door, or the reason the first homestead sat abandoned at the foot of the ridge. Nobody passed the warning on. Nobody said a word. They brought their children with them, and what followed was 18 months of sheer terror. And when it was over, for the first time in the recorded history of this land, they talked publicly. And what they said would pull a billionaire, a team of scientists, former military intelligence officers, and eventually the United States government to this exact piece of northeastern Utah. That's part 2, and it's coming. Now, I've spent a long time trying to understand this land, what it is, what it has always been, why every culture, every family, every person who's truly encountered this place has walked away telling the same story. Across 8,000 years, across every attempt to explain it away. And this fall, I'm going to stand on its edge myself. A couple of hours one evening, guided by people who know this property better than almost anybody alive. I'm not making promises about what I'll find, but I'm going to stand on the boundary of the only ground that every culture has agreed, for longer than recorded history, is different from everywhere else. And I'll tell you exactly what it feels like to be there. That's coming, so stay with this series. Well, that part won't be till this fall. You're going to want to stick around and see what happened to the family that moved in next, because they had some stories to tell. We'll see you in the next one.